So that's, yeah. And by the way, the Clash has endorsed that rendition.
Okay.
And it's, sort of another indication of the cultural zeitgeist in the direction of Ukraine from the West. And that's great. I understand the desire to rally around people that are fighting for their homeland against a foreign aggressor, that are trying to repel a communist thug and his army. I get that. Makes sense that the United States, in the interests of our belief in self determination, providing aid and support for Ukraine. But does that mean we should ignore all of the warts in Ukraine as well? That we should give Zelensky whatever he wants, back Zelensky whatever he says or does, which seems to be the position of the ruling class in D.C. Let me give you an example of the question I'm raising. And this isn't the first time he's done it. This is pre-Russian invasion. He's done it too. Zelensky announced a ban on 11 opposition political parties, alleging that they have ties to Russia. And he provided the list. But he didn't provide any evidence of the link to the Russian government. And this was... And the National Security Council in Ukraine immediately agreed to suspend the parties, whatever that looks like. But I mean, again, you have a country that in 30 years of independence has been a playground for oligarchs. This is not anything to say about Putin and Russia, just focusing on Ukraine and what we understand this to be. When you have, I cannot get over this, Republican senators like John Kennedy from Louisiana saying that after his address to Congress, Zelensky is now the leader of the free world.
Stop that craziness.
That is lunacy. And the Zelensky regime, as with previous regimes, both pro-West and, of course, certainly pro-Russian, like Yanukovych, are not without their problems. So, yes, you support Ukraine and you want to repel Putin's revanchism. But let's not lose our minds because we're so busy virtue signaling to one another how much we're in the fight psychologically with Ukraine. How about that? And perhaps let's take this opportunity to learn a little bit about Ukraine and Eastern Europe. For more on this, pleased to be joined by Lee Jones, Professor of Political Economy and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. He's the co-author of Fractured China, How State Transformation is Shaping China's Rise. Shaping China's Rise, that is. Lee Jones, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure to be with you.
So what about this ban on political parties by Zelensky? And as I alluded to, that he has used the state to... marginalize political opposition prior to Putin's invasion, hasn't he?
Yes, I mean the bottom line is that Ukraine is quite a divided society. As you say, it's had 3 decades of independence, but it's had very limited experience of independent nationhood. Parts of the western side of the country were integrated into the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. There were parts of Poland, and the east was part of the Russian Empire. And the territory of Ukraine was kind of cobbled together under Soviet rule. And so it has, it's very diverse ethnically and linguistically. There are Russian speakers, there are Ukraine speakers, and people speak these languages, usually both in their public and private lives. They share common culture, common heritage. And there are some people who particularly who live in the east and the south of the country, who tend towards Russian linguistically, and they have lots of kind of cultural and economic ties with Russia. And then there are people who concentrated in the center and the west of the country who look more towards the west culturally and economically. And those two sides have basically been fighting each other politically since Ukraine became independent. As early as the 1994 Ukrainian presidential election, the candidates were very much polarized around this regional divide. So that unfortunately has become caught up in the geopolitical contest between NATO on the western side and then Russia on the eastern side. So when Zelensky has banned these 11 political parties, which include the major opposition party, right, the second largest parliamentary bloc after Zelensky's own Servant of the People party, the one that is the most popular in the East. And he says, these parties have ties to Russia. What these parties do is they represent forces in Ukrainian society that want a closer relationship with Russia, and they don't want an armed confrontation with Russia. And no doubt, they probably receive some Russian support in the same way that the pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-EU parties have overtly received support from the West. So the fundamental problem, as I see it in Ukraine, is the internationalization of this domestic factional struggle, which is serving to essentially destroy the Ukrainian people.
Well, and then Zelensky yesterday, he merged all Ukrainian TV outlets into a singular platform, and then he suspended privately owned media companies. What was going on there, and why did he feel a need to do that?
So in Ukraine, as with the economy more broadly, the media sphere is dominated by oligarchic ownership. Essentially, in many parts of this post-Soviet sphere, the people who inherited political and economic power after the collapse of the Soviet Union were former Soviet-era officials, and their networks, essentially to begin with, criminal networks in the black market economy that had been operating extensively through the 1980s as the Soviet economy ran into trouble. So these groups sort of merged together after independence and became oligarchic enterprises in which ownership and control of the economy became heavily concentrated in the hands of just a few big companies. And those companies have bought up media assets or started their own media companies. So some of these stations, channels, and newspapers and so on are used by different oligarchic elites to pursue their own political interests. So what Zelensky is doing by basically nationalizing TV media and putting it all into a united TV channel under government control is basically to create government control over broadcast media and silence anybody that might give a different perspective, for example, a pro-Russian perspective in the war. And it's part of, this is not unusual in the context of war, right? So any part of modern warfare is control over informational space. So the Ukrainian government is pumping out a lot of war propaganda, as you would imagine any government in its position would do, and it's seeking to exert control over private media in order to solidify the nation behind the government fighting the Russian invasion.
Mm-hmm. And what about Zelensky and the ties to oligarchs in Ukraine? That's been, as I mentioned at the outset, for 30 years, an oligarchic playground, just as Russia has been. It's a bit different, but you still have sort of oligarchic-driven corruption, one would argue, and Zelensky is tied into some of that too. There have been stories, they don't get much play, but there have been stories about his offshore holdings and such that call into question whether or not there's some self-dealing going on by Zelensky, like we know there has been with Putin and autocrats of Putin's like.
Yeah, the two cases are actually quite different in this sense. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian economy was pillaged by oligarchs, so former officials, criminal business networks, and so on, as was the case in Ukraine. And that led to, as you say, Russia becoming the kind of playground of oligarchs, and they were just basically looting the former public wealth built up under the Soviet Union. Now, Putin was elected in part because he promised to put an end to that. So when people talk about Russian oligarchs today, it's as if they think that the Russian state is under the boot of all these rich business elites. But actually, Putin put a stop to that. He was elected to stop the decline and chaos that had beset Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. He put the oligarchs under state control.
Yeah.
So the oligarchs that wanted to
I don't want to interrupt. I don't want to interrupt, but just on the Putin thing, if you could address this while you're giving the rest of your answer. Putin, as I understand it, sort of, not that he's anti-corruption, he just strategically played the oligarchs off as power centers off against one another, and that's how he, maneuvered his way to power.
So basically what he did is he said, you can collaborate with me or you can be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
So he pushed lots of oligarchs into exile or prison, and the remaining ones are either business elites that have basically sworn their loyalty to him, or they're his men that he has placed in control of state-owned enterprises. And that is very different to the situation in Ukraine, where rival oligarchic elites still essentially control state power. So in Russia, the oligarchs are under the boot of the state. But in Ukraine, the state is under the boot of the oligarchs. So it's the inverse situation. So this is the difficulty when we cast around a term like oligarch. We need to think who's actually in control. In the case of Ukraine, Zelensky was elected on a platform of anti-oligarchic reforms to try to, stamp out corruption and introduce free market reforms. But he hasn't made very much progress. And that's partly because the whole state and the political system remains dominated by these oligarchic parties. And he himself has close allies of certain media elites. For example, he made his career playing the president in the TV comedy Servant of the People, which was on the media channel of a well-known media oligarch. And he relies, to prop up his government, to get things done. He relies on cutting deals with some of them. So his anti-oligarchic campaign has actually been very selective and mostly directed at pro-Russian oligarchs, which has obviously just annoyed Russia. So there is a deep problem of corruption and oligarchic control in Ukraine that various governments have really struggled to make any headway on.
I wanted to get to your take on something else too. This piece by Walter Russell Mead, and again, we're in this silly place of people are so emotional that any crossword, anything that is not a lapel pin or a social media flag, is sedition against the freedom fighters in Ukraine, and that's not the case. This is just about a policy, U.S. policy in terms of Western interest, starting with America from our perspective, and understanding exactly what the dynamic is in these countries individually as well as geopolitically. So this is not defending Putin or apologizing for Putin or rationalizing his invasion. But what Walter Russell Mead does, he talks a little bit about, how the rest of the world is actually reacting to the reaction of the West, the imposition of sanctions and so forth. And he makes the point that, oh, by the way, while the West is celebrating itself, China's approach of not endorsing Moscow's aggression, but resisting the West's efforts to punish Russia, getting support from South Africa, from Brazil, from India and Vietnam. And he makes the point, that a lot of these so-called third world countries, they don't like Putin, but they're not too down with the West's approach on these things either, because they feel like the West could turn on them, that the West isn't looking out for their interests in sort of a post-Russian invasion world. And we should be paying a little bit more attention to China's, Belt and Road exhibitions in third world country, particularly Africa, but not limited to Africa, also South America, because there's going to be a sort of a reckoning, a geopolitical reckoning, if we ignore the discomfort that the second and third world countries have with the Western response.
Yeah, I mean, I've not read the piece that you mentioned, but John Mearsheimer, who's a very famous structural realist professor at the University of Chicago, has been making this argument for years that the interest of the West should be in buddying up with Russia against China, because China is the long-range strategic threat and Russia is not. Russia is relatively weak economic power, right? It's only the 11th largest economy in the world. It's mainly limited to commodity exports. As we can see, it's struggling to make headway in Ukraine, which is a substantially weaker military power. So, Mearsheimer argues that NATO has made a strategic blunder by continuing to expand towards Russia's borders, which Russia can only see as a strategic threat against it. And we might not like that. We might wish that Putin didn't see things that way, but we can easily imagine what would happen if, say, Canada was to join a Russian military alliance, how the United States would react to that. And that's the basic equivalent. And we don't have to imagine very much. I mean, think how the United States reacted when Cuba entered an alliance with the Soviet Union in 1961 and put missiles on Cuba. That's just 90 kilometers off the Florida coast. Clearly, the United States wouldn't tolerate that, and the Russians cannot tolerate a neighboring country like Ukraine, which is adjacent, very large, sharing Russian culture, language, and so on. It can't tolerate NATO troops being stationed in Ukraine. So there are countries like China, for example, that recognize that Russia's security interests have been flouted by the West. This is not wise. At the same time, they recognize that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is disastrous in all kinds of ways, and they're trying to back the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. So they're walking a very difficult line. And as for other developing countries, I mean, they can also see what's at issue here, which is that the West has relentlessly expanded NATO in the direction of Russia. And really, it should have helped to settle the conflict in Ukraine by saying, OK, we're not going to expand any further. Ukraine should be neutral. And that's the best way to defend its democratic and territorial integrity against predation by outside forces. So when Western capitals claim the world is united against Russia, it's not quite so simple. As you say, a number of countries in the global south have voted, have abstained or voted against various UN resolutions because they see that the issue is slightly more complicated than a lot of people in Western capitals are suggesting. And they can also see that this conflict and the sanctions that are being imposed are going to have really detrimental consequences for many people in the global south. So in particular, the impact on fertilizer and food exports from both Ukraine and Russia is going to push global food prices through the roof. We've seen fertilizer prices go up to a level not seen since 2008, and food prices are predicted to rise anything from, say, 30 to 50% for key staples like wheat, for example. And some countries rely on imports from Ukraine and Russia for up to 100% of their wheat imports, for example. There are about 50 countries that depend on these exports for more than 30% of their wheat supplies. So we're looking at serious hunger, rising malnutrition in developing countries. So these are some of the kind of spillover consequences of a war involving major exporting powers. This is not some tiny little country.
Professor Jones, we're going to have to leave it there, but appreciate your time. Sure. Professor of Political Economy and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. It is now 7 a.m. WIND, Chicago.
Ukraine keeps fighting back. I'm Dave Anthony, Fox News. It's retaken a key suburb of the capital, Kyiv, from Russian forces, but Ukraine's president, in a plea to Italy's parliament for help, says
the air bombs keep killing Ukrainian people, and some cities like Mariupol are fully destroyed.
The UN says 3.5 million Ukrainians have fled the country. President Biden will go to Poland later this week, where most of them have gone. He angered Russia, calling leader Vladimir Putin a war criminal. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby just told Fox.
We see that the Russians are clearly, there's clear evidence that their military, their forces are conducting war crimes.
In an hour, Ketanji Brown Jackson will be back at the Senate.
During this hearing, I hope that you will see how much I love our country.
Nominated to replace retiring Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, Jackson faces questions today from senators. Republicans like Josh Hawley suggest she's soft on crime.